Good day. Let me just say to everybody on behalf of the SRC, our sincerest apologies for the delay on our end. We we know you've been waiting for 15 minutes, and that's a great sign that you're interested in the content. And we will try to avoid these issues moving forward. But thank you so much for joining us. Um, so on behalf of the SRC, let me welcome you all to the third installment of our virtual, oh gosh, Alicia, you're gonna have to help me with the formal name. I'm a little bit ruffled.
That's okay. Virtual Trade and Investment Research Series.
Exactly. As you will know, this is really meant to be quite an intimate discussion, usually featuring a young researcher paired with a more experienced researcher on a topic of interest to the region. And sometimes we reach out to persons outside the region, but we're always so honored to have people within the region join our students and give them feedback, but also just take the topic to a broader level in terms of some of the implications more generally. I'll let Alicia, who is the moderator, do that kind of formal introduction. On my part, let me just say that the work of the SRC is galloping along in terms of looking at industrial policy. As we know for the region, this is very important. The CARICOM Secretariat has been working, I know, very closely with a working group that has been set up, as well as with international organizations to look at approaches towards regional industrial policy. We also know that at the WTO, in the context of the most recent ministerial conference, there has been discussion about how to make industrial policy something that is more closely tied to what's happening broadly in the negotiations. And so it has come up in that context. But as we move into the sustainability and green economy, regional industrial policy, how do countries organize their policies so that they align at the regional level across global value chains, but regional value chains as well, and how do governments pick winners in that context has been really, really something that is ripe for discussion. And so we're so pleased that we have a student who's done his work on industrial policy from the MITP with a seasoned negotiator and researcher in the region, Malcolm, to start us off on this discussion. So let me just welcome you on behalf of the Sridhar Rampal Center and hand over for the moderation of this event to our trade researcher, Ms. Alicia Nichols, who will be taking the discussion forward. So welcome everyone, and apologies again for the late start. Over to you, Alicia.
Thank you so much, Jan, for that really comprehensive overview and warm welcome, as we often do it here at the SRC. So my name is Alicia Nichols. I'm the Junior Research Fellow here with the SRC, and it really is a pleasure to be your moderator for today and to have with me two excellent panelists. Our featured speaker, Mr. Christopher Richards, who will introduce momentarily, and our esteemed discussant, Mr. Malcolm Spence. So as my director pointed out just now, this is the third installment in our virtual series. We've had two so far, and this third one focuses specifically on industrial policy, particularly exploring Barbados's industrial policy framework over the period 2007 to 2012. And to present his research is Mr. Christopher Richards, one of our star students of our Masters in International Trade Policy program. And he is an adept professional in international trade policy and data analysis. He has worked in government and consultancy roles. His expertise includes policy analysis, stakeholder engagement, project management, and he excels in crafting strategic insights and solutions. His academic pursuits reflect a deep commitment to understanding and navigating the complexities of global trade dynamics, and is therefore no surprise that he decided to do this study. Additionally, we have Mr. Malcolm Spence, who is no stranger to us in the trade community, and I'll introduce him. I'll read his bio after Christopher speaks. So, Christopher, I'll hand over to you to share with us your paper, and then I would introduce Malcolm, who is going to be our discussant and give his reactions. Thank you so much. Over to you, Christopher.
Okay, great, and thank you so much. Is it okay that I can share a PowerPoint?
Certainly, one moment. Let me give you sharing privileges. Okay, let me work on that for you, Christopher. In the interim, you could just start and I would revert to you. Oh, okay, great.
Okay, great. Well, good morning, everyone. And my paper was titled as Small Island Development States, Did Barbados 2007-2012 Industrial Policy Framework Support Export Diversification in Goods and Services, and what improvements can be made to such policies? Right. Slide. Right. So for my paper, I would have utilized a qualitative approach and extensively utilize secondary sources, which include various books, historical literature, policies, and online statistical databases such as the World Bank data, the OAS, American Organization of American States, and data from the actual industrial policy. This method was the best way for me to understand the complex phenomena and the processes that cannot be easily quantified. And it was the best way to explore and see how and why certain things had happened with what developed to that industrial policy being the way that it is. So I would like to focus on three theoretical frameworks, the plantation economy, capitalism, and the Keynesian model. Forgive me if I pronounced it wrong. I would have really liked to go through different theories such as C.L.R. James, Clive Thomas, liberalization, and the Washington Consensus and Stiglitz, but we would probably be here until 3 o'clock if I did that. So I'll just concise it to these three theoretical frameworks to best kind of describe the build-up to our current, well, 2007-2012 industrial policy. So by examining Pacific economic theories, we gain insight on how historical factors such as colonialism, slavery, and the plantation system legacy has shaped industrialization efforts, particularly in Barbados. The theory of the plantation economy underscores the significant impact of agriculture-based plantation, such as especially sugar, on its socio-economic dynamics in the Caribbean, but more specifically, Barbados. This system relied on a reliance on slave labor, monocrop production, such as sugar, and the export dependency. And this kind of molded the industrial policy to, at that time, the thoughts behind it. Gunnar Myrdal, who is a Swedish economist and sociologist, he offered a different approach when it came to looking at industrial policy or industrialization on a whole. He kind of looked at it from the perspective of the plantation economy actually being a pillar of industrialization for Western society. He looked at it not like as a consequence or, as slavery on a whole. He looked at it more as this is a foundation of what led to the industry, like the success of the bigger developed states. And to further emphasize and tie in capitalism with the plantation economy, Karl Marx's analysis of capitalism would further eliminate the operational dynamics within the plantation system, particularly in terms of the production and labor control tailored to meet the market demands. With a multifaceted approach and to understand the complex interplay of the historical legacies compared to the modern economic development of the Caribbean, the plantation economy and its heavy reliance on a single cash crop created a economic vulnerability for Barbados as fluctuations in sugar prices and market conditions directly impacted the island's economic stability. And even after the decline of the sugar industry, the legacy of the plantation economy kind of still continued to influence the country's economic structure and its ability to adapt to the changing global market dynamic. Moreover, the plantation economy resulted in a hierarchical society with deep racial, and class divisions that persist today, affecting social and economic opportunities in Barbados. For example, capitalist theory can aid in understanding how profit motive kind of drove the expansion of the sugarcane cultivation and then the establishment of the sugar plantations. The pursuit of profit and the demand for sugar in global markets incentivize the the use of the slave labor on a large scale of exploitation of the natural resources of our natural resources. And the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of the plantation owners and the exploitations of the enslaved laborers were fundamental aspects of the capitalist dynamics in the plantation economy. Um, and then the historical inequalities of satisfaction stemming from the plantation economy influenced the distribution of resources, power and dynamics, and social mobility within the country. So these factors kind of pose challenges when it came to promoting diversification and creating an exclusive, economic environment that benefits all areas or all corners of society. And then lastly, the last economic model I'd like to look at is the Keynesian model. Again, forgive me if I butchered that pronunciation. But that model was mainly a theory that advocated for the government intervention to stabilize and influence, I guess, the demand for the commodity. But this model kind of, it was really government intervention in the market. But what happened really was in the 1974, 1975, when they had the recession, it kind of marked a significant down point for Keynesian economists. The period challenge it faced like rapid inflation and unemployment. And as inflation had reached its highest level in the past 50, at that time for 50 years, it led to a loss of faith in the Keynesian model, which shifted to more the adoption of industrial policy as an alternative approach. However, the realm of industrial policy, the Keynesian model still offers valuable insights into its effectiveness of government interventions. These interventions include infrastructure, investments, incentives, and targeted support for key industries, all aimed at promoting industrial development and export diversification. A notable example would be South Korea, actually, because during the 1960s to 70s, South Korea government kind of implemented policies, industrial policies, that kind of focused on steel, shipbuilding, and electronics. So their policies were just catered directly. They had more of a long goal approach, the long-term approach. And it's interesting because due to this, they were able to branch off into other things and they started to focus into more light goods, like wigs. And who knew that South Korea would have 10% of their exports would have been primarily wigs. And then they were able to branch off into different areas of exportation. Now, when looking at Barbados industrial policy, it boasts several strengths, and it was really a solid foundation for its industrial policy because it utilizes its proximity to major markets such as North America and the UK, which presents potential trade advantages and enable easier access to large consumer bases. The manufacturing sector significantly contributes a lot to the country's GDP and employment generation, underscoring its economic importance. Additionally, there was also a focus on developing high-value traditional products that reflect Barbadian heritage, culture, and enhancing the appeal to the global market. The establishment of the Caribbean Single Market Economy, CSME, allows for Barbadian firms to expand production, trade, and attract investments within regional markets. But CSME also supports the free movement of large graduate and skilled individuals providing access to larger scale pools for the country industrial sector. But despite the strengths, the industrial policy also recognized several weaknesses and the structural inefficiencies in the manufacturing sector, including the limited access to new technologies and inadequate marketing programs, pose competitive challenges. High operating costs, particularly in labor and energy, impacted the price of competitive Barbadian goods and in the international market, and a weak entrepreneurial culture and inadequate management practices kind of contribute in the insufficient knowledge and skills within the workforce, hindering productivity and innovation. Additionally, at the time, by the way, this is not now, but at the time, the investment sector and its reluctance to form a sustainable partnership further limit the growth opportunities. Insufficient funding for research and development also hampered or would have stifled efforts to foster creativity and innovation in the industrial sector. But the industrial policy also acknowledges several threats, and it must be addressed to know that the successful implementation intense competition in the traditional export markets and domestic markets from producers in developed nations and emerging economies. Well, additionally, the economy's vulnerability to economic shocks, especially what happened in COVID, would have and tourism would have really hampered, especially in our tourist sector, would have really hampered the development of the industrial policy. But a way forward would be to fully digitize, taking examples from Estonia, the digital infrastructure and e-government sources, export promotion and enhancing competitiveness, which we at the Caribbean Export does very well. There are institutions or organizations that are currently doing great work in that field and investment opportunities and financing support. So yeah, so I didn't want it to make it too long, but I wanted to make it straight to the point. And that will be the end of the presentation.
Okay, thank you so much, Christopher. And I'll hand over now to Mr. Spence. But before that, I'll just introduce him a bit, although he's really no stranger to any of us in the trade community. So Mr. Malcolm Spence has worked for the Caribbean in their international trade agreement negotiations for more than 20 years. And he's currently the senior coordinator for intellectual property, science, and technology issues for the region's external trade negotiations, based in the external trade unit of the CARICOM Single Market and Trade Directorate in the Caribbean Community Secretariat Office based in Barbados. And he has a Bachelor of Science in Agricultural Engineering, and he has an MSc in Manufacturing for Agricultural and Industrial Development, both from Cranfield University in the UK. So when I say he's an expert in this area, that's no exaggeration. He really is. So over to you, Malcolm. Looking forward to getting your reaction, your perspectives on this as a practitioner.
Thanks, Alicia, and let me thank SRC for inviting me to share my thoughts on this topic. And let me congratulate Christopher on the research paper that he's done, because he's brought together in that research paper a number of different elements, all of which need to be considered, not just in the context of Barbados's industrial policy, but I think in the context of industrial policy generally. And I would go so far as to say particularly for the region. And the comments that I'll make will touch on a number of aspects that Christopher developed in his research paper, all of which I think allow for further development. So one of the first things that I would say to Christopher, is that I think the work he has done here is a great start towards a more academic paper, perhaps a PhD, that would allow him to explore some of these things in more detail. One of the challenges he had, of course, is access to data. And I don't know how I can suggest you overcome that except by time and effort. And that's going to require you, I think, to network, to find sources and find mirror sources that can then lead you back to the original source and interrogate those sources effectively. But in terms of comments on this topic, I think I want to begin by um, trying to, well, by suggesting that there is a difference between policy and strategy that I think generally in the region and internationally in the literature is often not made pellucidly clear. Um, Policies and strategies, when people talk about industrial policies, I often find that the documents that are produced integrate the two almost seamlessly, and often with good reason, because I think at government level, people want to know the how, not necessarily the why. And for me, policy is about the why. So an industrial policy should contain that particular government's vision, and then a set of principles and rules that uh, all the economic actors within the economy will follow in order to achieve the overall vision that has been espoused. And the value of a policy is that it should create a certain cohesiveness amongst the actors moving in a particular direction, and it should also be inclusive. Um, a strategy, on the other hand, is this sort of plan of action where you identify specific goals, you use the data that you have, you measure where you are, you set goals in terms of data, goals that are measurable, etc. You have a monitoring evaluation system that tells you how you're progressing along that line. And then, of course, you have your risk mitigation um, aspect, which strategy it's in itself, which gives you the guidance on how you might change if things are not going the way you expected. And I'll come back to that because I think that's an important thing, particularly for us as small states. So now, talking about small states, I think in terms of developing policy, this is really the crux of where whatever we read in the literature needs to be uh, rethought in the context of our own specific condition. Um, and the biggest element I think that we face in terms of developing a policy is that we don't have the economies of scale that many of the economic theories that Christopher mentioned would take into account. We don't have those economies of scale that would allow us to compete effectively for long periods of time in most areas of economic activity using price competitiveness. In other words, we will not be able to make cheap goods. Most of the things which we might want to produce, others will be able to produce it um, cheaper using economies of scale. Uh, and we won't have that advantage. So I think it is important for us to recognize that our approach then to developing policies, industrial policies, will have to rely on differentiation. We will have to be able to sell products that people want to buy for what the product is, not because of how cheap it is. And that should move us away from the commodities that were inherent in the plantation economies, etc., to products that are, um, as Christopher mentioned in his paper, based on our natural inheritance. They are our products that are good enough for other people to want to try to buy. Now, the other disadvantage that we have, and Christopher mentions it in his paper more than once, is this sort of dilemma between proximity and remoteness. Our trading routes are fairly narrow and fairly limited. We have we have a small number of major trading partners generally, and so all our trade routes tend to go to those markets. And that does not give us necessarily the sort of diversity of markets globally that we may want to be able to reach. And because those channels are not there, it makes it more difficult for us to send goods and services out. Um, And one of the ways in which I think small states like ours can overcome this is by producing what we tend to call weightless products. In other words, products that have high added value and are easy to transport. The digital environment, of course, creates a perfect opportunity for us to create those kinds of products because with a touch of the button, you can get a distribution of all the kinds of products on the digital economy that we are more than capable of producing. Um, the other aspects of production that we have, besides the challenge of scale differentiation, weightless products, is partnerships and linkages. And I think this is also quite critical. We have a number of trade agreements, like the one with Europe and other trading arrangements with others, that allow us the opportunity not just to get access to those markets, but also to develop the kinds of partnerships that can locate us at the important points in global value chains that would maximize our productivity at that particular stage. And this question of productivity, I think, is key. Um, our productivity rates, I think, are comparatively low. And one of the things which I think is important for us to try to do through an industrial policy is to increase those levels of productivity. Now, the way this is done in most places is, of course, by uh, developing innovation systems. Again, Christopher mentions it in his document, and unfortunately, from my own bias, I think a lot more could have been done uh, with that in mind. And the next section that I'll talk about as well, I think, is important. But this is all future work that I think Christopher could do to build on the work that he has done so well. So increasing productivity by developing, for example, innovation systems. I can't say that there is an easy to identify national innovation system in Barbados, or in fact in the region. And an innovation system, there is no clear definition of what an innovation system is, but it usually relies on networks of public and private sector actors within the economy who are collaborating strongly in ways that can move information about what they're all doing, what direction they're going in, and allows them um, to create new products or to find ways in which they can utilize new products that have been created effectively to solve any challenges that they may be having. So within these innovation systems, there are a number of elements that I think are important that you need to understand. One has to do with diversity. I think diversity breeds creativity. The greater access you have to more diverse conditions and ideas, the more you're likely to be able to combine these in new and effective ways, which is the essence of creativity. Information, I think, is critical, and the digital environment now allows us access to information that could then allow us to select those areas that would be beneficial for us to invest in terms of innovation. And then again, coming back to partnerships, I think it is critical to emphasize that partnerships with the international community, global partnerships, also allow us to not only access resources and to access markets, but to participate in the value chains that are established already internationally. And there is so much to discuss, but I'm going to just focus on these four key points that I've mentioned. The first one being the difference between policy and strategy. The second one, the question of scale, innovation systems. And then it'll be no surprise to people that know me that this last section is going to be on the intellectual property system. I think there has been a great deal of misunderstanding about the value of an intellectual property system, both the global system and the national system. One of the key policy objectives of the intellectual policy system is to bring information out of the um, secret trade secret area into the public domain. And that often seems to people like a contradiction in terms. But the intellectual property system, as a policy tool, is designed to bring information into the public domain. it does it as a bargain between the creator of that information, those new solutions, and the state, where the state allows that individual, that creator, that innovator, an opportunity of exclusivity to be able to exploit the innovation in whatever way they think is appropriate. And I think one of the things which needs to be done, and I would direct Christopher to doing, is to do something that's called an intellectual asset audit, a national intellectual asset audit for Barbados. That way, I think some of the historical advantages that may not be obviously apparent in Barbados could be brought to light. One very good example is the sugarcane breeding station, which is based here in Barbados, which I know has developed a variety of sugarcane that has a higher sugar content than any other sugarcane internationally, and higher sugar content than was expected to be possible in sugarcane. So an intellectual asset audit, using the intellectual property system and the information that I just mentioned it provides, I think is another important aspect which is not sufficiently utilized, and again, which Christopher can explore a lot more. And that is using, for example, the patent databases. There are over 6 million applications for patent internationally. In the patent office in Barbados, I'd be surprised if there were more than 100 in any one year, which means that all those other technologies that are protected by patent in other jurisdictions are not protected by patent in our jurisdiction, and provides the opportunity for us to absorb technologies that may be used in other ways that can solve our industrial problems, but are not protected within our jurisdictions. And then the question of the rights framework, intellectual property rights framework, and its enforcement. I think that's another area which could, again, more work could be done on. And although Barbados collaborates very effectively with WIPO, I think a lot more could be done, particularly on the enforcement of intellectual property rights. And of course, the way in which intellectual property rights ultimately provide value are through licensing regimes. So understanding how to license intellectual property rights. And this, of course, is the more legal aspect of it, establishing those licensing contracts, both to bring technology into Barbados, as well as to exploit the technologies that are developed by Barbados. And this takes me back to what I was saying about weightless products. By innovating and protecting your innovations using the international intellectual property rights system, you're able to license those innovations to those people who have the economies of scale to be able to produce your products at very low cost. This is what the United States was doing when it was exploiting the cheap manufacturing sector in Asia generally, in China in particular. The cell phones and everything else were being produced there using the intellectual property rights that had been developed through the innovation system in the United States. And in many ways, although we're operating on a much smaller scale, that's where scale of economy does not prevent as much of a challenge. So I think I'm going to stop there. There's so much to talk about, and as those who know me would recognize, I would continue talking for the next hour. But let's see if we can get some questions from the audience.
Thank you so much, Malcolm. And that's one of the beauties about these virtual series, getting the very fruitful comments and insights from experts and practitioners in these areas which the researchers are speaking on. And you mentioned so many interesting things. You talked about the difference between policy and strategy. You talked about scale, about innovation systems. You talked about your baby, intellectual property, including the suggestion about intellectual asset audit. That's quite interesting. So we have several questions here, and one of them asks about weightless products. This is to you, Malcolm. I'm going to come to Christopher shortly, but because you mentioned weightless products, one of the questions here is, what exactly are weightless products? What will be examples of them?
Absolutely. So, music, for example, in the digital environment, software. But I would go even further because I don't want to exclude the manufacturing capacity that is possible, and things like essences, like flavors, like catalysts used in chemistry experiments and so on. These are all small products that weigh very little, but which have extremely high value on the international market. So one of the areas which is perhaps more relevant now is actually pharmaceuticals, the active ingredient in pharmaceuticals, which then get compiled by other people into pills and all sorts of other things using fillers and carriers. But developing the essential ingredient, the active ingredient in pharmaceuticals, is another area that provides a product that has very low weight, easy to transport, but brings in huge value.
Thank you so much for that clarification. And we have a lot of questions coming in. And if you have any other questions, audience, please feel free. We want this to be as engaging and interactive as possible. So we have a question here. Since then, has there been, and this one I'll direct to Christopher and Malcolm, you could feel free to jump in as well. Has there been any government regulatory interventions, this is with regard to Barbados, to encourage the uptake of new technologies in the manufacturing and trade industries? Christopher?
Hey, yeah, thank you. And there have been a number of initiatives that have been taken to update newer technologies in manufacturing and trade. One of them would have been the Barbados Economic Recovery and Transformation. Another one would have been the Digital Transformation Strategy, Smart Bridgestone Initiative, incentives for renewable energy that we've seen recently with the Ministry of Energy, and training and skills development. I've recently been seeing a lot of partnerships across the area on that. So yeah, there have been a lot of initiatives that government has and still currently undergoing to really promote manufacturing and trade industries, and even in education. Another lightweight good would be education, which is one that that currently takes part in. So yeah, and when it comes to trade, I mean there's still a lot of barriers when it comes to financing. It's really hard to have receiving funds from overseas. There are limitations with Western Union. You have a limit there, MoneyGram. And these are all things that kind of hinder the development for trade. And I do know that they're currently undergoing policies to work around it. So yeah, that's my answer there.
Thank you so much, Christopher. And Malcolm, you wanted to jump in here as well?
Yes, yes. Although Christopher has done a good job in answering it, but I was scrolling through some of the other questions as well, and I'm glad Christopher mentioned education as another example of a weightless product. Online education, I think, is absolutely an area in which Barbados and the region generally, I think, has a strong competitive advantage, um, which we are not exploiting as effectively as we could do. Um, but one of the questions was about services and industrial policy. And yes, you're quite right, questioner, because often when people talk about industrial policy, the first kind of area that jumps to mind is manufacturing. But that's not correct. I think there is an artificial divide between manufacturing and services. You can hardly do manufacturing without services, and many services rely on products for the provision of that service that comes from the manufacturing sector. So an industrial policy, a national industrial policy, has to take into account how you're going to meld both manufacturing, both production of goods and production of services into ways that are effective and competitive.
Thank you so much, Malcolm. And Christopher, directly to you. Um, one question was, what was your rationale for undertaking this specific topic? What methodology did you use? And what were your specific methods for data collection?
I really wanted to kind of look at. So the thing is when I was looking at the industrial policy, I really wanted to look at why and what led up to us being the way we are now. What led us to the stage? Because, not to repeat the same mistakes from the past, but to kind of see what led to, the monocrop, the dependency on European and the American markets. And I just really wanted to look into the history of it. My methodology, I believe I would have highlighted, would have been secondary resources. I would have extracted it from the World Bank, World Trade Bank. The industrial policy itself would have some data points as well. I mean, it was very hard to get access to the industrial policy. It took me a long time. It was very hard to get hold of. And could you repeat the question, the other part of the question, please?
Okay, one moment. I think you answered both though, but let me just scroll back through. Right, the methods. What were your methods? But you mentioned them. The fact that you went on like the World Bank's database, etc., for your desk research and whatnot. So, okay. So next,
If I could come in here quickly,
Sure.
Alicia, because I mentioned it when I was talking about the challenges that we have developing industrial policy generally, and that Christopher, I'm sure, faced as well. And that is getting all the data that you probably would like to have. Now, Christopher focused his work on the 2007 to 2012 industrial policy in Barbados. But of course, as one of the questioners mentioned, Barbados, going much further back in generations before, actually had quite strong manufacturing capacity. I think it was the energy crisis that started to change some of those competitive elements when the cost of energy for Barbados became so high that its outputs were not competitive. But at that time, the kinds of industrial policies were investment by invitation industrial policy and import substitution industrial policy. And in both of those cases, innovation was not necessarily a sufficiently strong component of the policy. And I think that's perhaps where Barbados and other countries in the region should have pivoted instead of throwing up the external protection barriers to try to protect those import substitution investments that had been made.
Thank you so much, Malcolm. I see my director has her hand up. Go ahead, Jan.
I don't want to preempt any questions from the audience, but for some reason, because I'm a panelist, I couldn't put my question in the Q&A window. So I wanted to get a little bit more granular with the panelists on the specific sectors that they think provide a pathway for the future in terms of not just Barbados's industrial policy, but regional industrial policy, because there's a resurgence of that kind of analysis happening in Asia, in Africa. And we have a built-in agenda, or at least a built-in set of provisions in our revised Treaty of Chaguaramas dealing with regional industrial policy that probably needs to be revisited, may need to be upgraded, or may be sufficient because it just forms sort of the bare bones of what our industrial policy as a region should look like. So against that background, I guess I'm asking, one, what is being done already in that frame? Because as I mentioned, I know Suriname has been given responsibility in a sense to promote a regional industrial policy. And linked to that is, I know in Africa, they're looking at textiles, they're looking at critical minerals. These are sort of the areas. And in Latin America, the green economy and even, cross-regional electricity energy grids. Do we have specific areas in CARICOM that we are looking at to grow these regional industrial policies and value chains, and what work is being done for that kind of analysis and actual policy to be deployed. Any ideas?
I presume that's directed at me, John. So I'll take it. Although Christopher, I'm sorry, Christopher, for calling you Richard all the time. But
It's Richards is his surname, so it's okay.
But Christopher did actually mention it in his paper as well. The question of regional, the CSME and its contribution to the way in which an industrial policy in any one member of the region might develop it. And as you mentioned, the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, it's one of the key things that the treaty, I think, had hoped would happen would be production integration across the region. And unfortunately, that hasn't happened because I think even within the region, individual states have not yet seen integration with other economies in the region becoming as intimate as the framers of the treaty perhaps would have expected or liked. And I think that's part of the challenge, but it's also still the opportunity. So you ask about picking winners. One of the failings, I think, of industrial policy in the past was this sort of integration that I mentioned between policy and strategy, where as part of the strategy that was sometimes clothed as policy, they picked certain sectors and decided that was where they were going to go. The approach that I would recommend would be not to do that in terms of a policy directive, but to recognize that that must just be a particular strategy that you have for achieving a policy objective. Now, and one of the questioners asked about sargassum, and that points me to the area of biodiversity. We have states like Guyana and Suriname and Belize with its Mesoamerican forest areas that have huge biodiversity. But in addition to that, what we don't recognize is that across the island states, we have huge marine biodiversity, which is almost unexploited. There was work being done at Cave Hill on assays of many of the marine organisms that are available around Barbados to try to determine if there were any pharmaceutical capacity or pharmaceutical elements, pharmacology, that might come out of the result of those assays. I'm not sure where that work has gone, but that's exactly the kind of thing that I think would be and should be encouraged by incentives that would form part of your strategy for implementing a policy that is directing you towards weightless products. So I think if you took that as your overall guide, the recognition that as small states, we won't have economies of scale. So we have to produce the intellectual output that can be monetized through the intellectual property system. Then I think that's the direction that the industrial policy should help head in. And that is something that can be done regionally as well. And by regionally, I would not exclude the Dominican Republic and Cuba from a regional innovation system. Cuba has done a fantastic job with its own innovation system. It has international patents. It has patented internationally many of the outputs of its medical research sector, which is exactly along the lines that I've been describing.
Thank you so much for that, Malcolm. I mean, it segues so nicely into this question here. It says, innovation is a result of rivalry between firms to achieve a competitive advantage. And the questioner asks, what policy reforms can the government introduce? The Barbados government, I take it that the anonymous attendee is referring to, other than tax incentives and educational reforms. So you mentioned Cuba using intellectual property protections, for instance. Are there any other areas, Christopher and then Malcolm?
Could you repeat the question one more time?
Sure. So what policy reforms could the Barbados government introduce other than tax incentives and educational reform to help promote innovation?
That would have to be financial. Being able to access certain payment methods, like, making making financial services more accessible to the locals, like PayPal, because PayPal, you have like this 30-day waiting period. Western Union has, and it's always about this thing about to prevent money laundering and stuff like that. Even when you're looking to even invest in certain products, you have a limit to the amount of money you can even spend. And say you're a small business owner, you just got a credit card and you wanted to invest in some product, you you can only spend a limit. There's a limit that you can actually spend, and it prevents you from. And then you have to go to the central bank, and then there's a whole bunch of processes before you can actually get to a certain point, and it kind of stifles and hinders development. So the financial service is an area that I would definitely want reforming.
Thanks so much, Christopher. Malcolm, you want to jump in?
Yes, and I'm not sure that I necessarily agree with Christopher. I mean, I think the question of finance for innovation is a big one, especially long-term finance for innovation, which is where the state should actually be playing a role, as he mentioned in his paper was done in Korea. I think if you're looking in the long run, then you're looking at state financing. And the challenge with state financing, of course, is this external debt that Barbados is carrying. I mean, I think it's nearly 140% of GDP. That's clearly going to be, it's going to make it very difficult for the government of Barbados to decide where it's going to spend its money, the remainder of the money that it has after it's paying its debt. But absolutely, outside of education, I would say it's a question, therefore, of partnerships. There are international investors who would be willing to come in if they find good ideas. And so the innovation system, I think, needs to be made much more inclusive. It needs to use more effectively the information that is available, as I mentioned, for example, from the intellectual property system. And then it has to encourage innovation and creativity. It needs to identify problems, the state as a policy level, and say these are problems we want solutions to, and throw that out to the private sector and let the private sector try and find those solutions in the most effective way. Not necessarily just importing solutions that are applied in other places, but finding ways in which those solutions themselves become unique solutions that might find application in external markets through the licensing that I was talking about.
Thanks, Malcolm. So, Christopher, well, I mean, many of us have faced many of the barriers that you have highlighted. One of the attendees has noted, I found barriers using platforms like Etsy and PayPal for selling digital products. So there definitely is merit to what you're saying as well with regard to the need to ensure that we are able to use these platforms, especially entrepreneurs being able to use these platforms and being able to monetize on some of these international platforms as well. So we have questions are coming in fast and furious, so forgive me, guys. I'm trying to keep up with them. So another question here is, one of the bottlenecks to the development of industrial policy, which was mentioned, was scale. And this ties into the earlier discussion talking about leveraging the region, etc. And the person notes, how could we use the natural resources from countries like Guyana, Suriname, and Belize to create regional supply chains? So I'll direct this first to Christopher, and then I'll go to Malcolm.
Could you repeat the question one more time, please?
Certainly. So what consideration is being given to leverage the natural resources from countries like Guyana, Suriname, and Belize to create regional supply chains?
I think I may need assistance with that question.
Okay, that's quite all right. Malcolm?
Yes, so I come back to what I was saying before. I think well, actually, Janive kind of pointed pointed towards it. The region is developing an industrial strategy, which should be a regional industrial strategy, not just a combination of national industrial strategies. And that question of production integration that was foreseen by the developers of the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas really needs to be given greater weight. The idea that, for example, you have natural resources, both mineral and biological, in some of these larger countries, and then you have energy resources in other countries, and then you have, of course, innovation resources, I would call them, centers of creativity in countries that may not have either the mineral and natural biological resources or the energy resources. We should be able to combine all of those within the single market framework. And that then gives us a bit better scale, and scale is always going to be important no matter what you're doing, but it creates the diversity that allows for greater creativity. And I think it is that creativity which has to form the basis of developments of our policies, particularly industrial policy.
Thanks,
May I just
Malcolm.
also
Go
add
ahead.
a little comment on the question before? And
Certainly.
you mentioned intellectual asset audits, the question of financing, I mean. In Jamaica, they've introduced a law that allows intellectual property rights to be used as collateral for loans at the bank. And I think this is one of the things which, in terms of a policy framework, is a good pointer. It's really part of a strategy, but the strategy is to try and encourage people to use their intellectual property assets as collateral for loans, and that then gives the bank something that they can use other than bricks and mortar, which is the traditional collateral that banks insist on.
Thank you so much, Malcolm. And I'm thinking about as well, there being several initiatives, mainly in terms of agriculture. So, like the regional food terminal that they've been talking about, and the the sending of black belly sheep from Barbados to Guyana, among other things. So, there's a lot going on. I think probably there needs to be, as with many things, more information about. We hear about the initial initiatives, but we need to hear about the follow-up. Okay, so some other questions are coming in. Forgive me, guys, but I'm really happy with the level of audience engagement because we have a lot of questions coming in. And I'll ask you if you could please keep your questions as precise as possible, because some of them I've had to rearrange in order to get a specific question. Okay, so Christopher, this one was directed to you. In your view, what has failed various governments in Barbados? Now, bearing in mind, I know that you were focused more on the strategy within a certain period of time, but in your view, what do you think has failed various governments in Barbados to implement longevity policies related to export diversification? Why is it that it's been difficult for them to implement policies, longevity policies related to export diversification?
Yeah, and that's why I would have took the approach of looking at the historical context, the plantation economy, and all of that would have led up to like the stifling of newer policies. That's such a complex question to answer. Let's see. I think that being dependent on monocrop, and there's a term I'm looking for. I think it's a theory, Robert something, but there was a period of opportunity that we kind of missed when it came to industrialization and exports that we've seen places like South Korea, Mauritius, and they all really utilize that time period when it came to exportation and investing. It's like South Korea and China took huge investments into shipbuilding, and now we can see like how now they're reaping the benefits of it on a huge scale. And now when we look at that, we kind of focus so much on tourism, and then when COVID happened, we saw how COVID really stifled tourism. Even we did very well in overcoming it, recovering the COVID recovery, but still, what happens when another external shock happens? So I think we kind of didn't appreciate Sir Arthur Lewis's economic model. We did try, we did invest in, we do have financial services, we do have a lot, I mean, we're currently doing a lot of things to overcome that, but I would say we kind of really missed that opportunity that other countries have really utilized.
Thanks, Christopher. And there's been just a shift a bit. There's been talk, we spoke a lot about the regional context, but one of the questions from earlier, which I missed, was with regard to the international context, as in how are we leveraging our relationships with other countries to assist us? So I have a question here. Are the recent efforts to connect with Africa bearing fruit and opening up new routes? And does this expand the routes available? So this would be with regard to trade routes, I imagine, is what the person is asking. Have recent efforts to build relations with Africa been bearing fruit? My question to you, Christopher, do you see Africa as our deepening relation with Africa rather as one way in which it could help us in terms of our industrial policy, in terms of not just in terms of maybe cooperation, but also are there any areas that maybe we could learn from them?
Yeah, Africa is rich in resources too. And they're definitely undergoing initiatives to deepen relationships with Africa. And and there can be technology transfer, educational services as well over there. So yeah, there is great potential. They we'll probably see the benefits of that in the next couple of years. But no, yeah, there is great potential and opportunity in partnering and having relationships with Africa.
Okay, and then thank you so much, Christopher. And then there's another question here. Are there any plans to have tool libraries to remove financial barriers to using new technologies? I'm not too sure if either you are familiar with those.
No, I wouldn't be.
Okay, so perhaps, questioner, if you don't mind, just explain a little bit what you mean by that. That might assist. Another, I see Gavin had his hand up for a while. Gavin, you wanted to make an intervention? Or maybe you could put it in the chat. Okay, because we're running out of time. So
Alicia, just to help, I think Gavin has written the questions. I don't know if you asked it. He had quite a few questions in the chat. I don't know if you missed them.
I got one of them. I am not seeing the other.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So Gavin, if you could, if there's another question that you have, you could put it in the chat as I go through the other questions. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us. Another one, and this one is quite interesting. Barbados was deemed, it says Barbados was deemed uncompetitive in manufacturing due to energy costs in the past, which is true. How can the new focus on PV energy systems be incorporated to support industrial development? Malcolm, you want to take this?
Yes, sure. I mean, I did mention it earlier on. I think that there was a time when Barbados, in spite of high energy costs and high labor costs, was competitive in manufacturing, particularly when they were looking at products that were not purely import substitution products, but which were developing using technologies that were being used for imported products on local products. And one of the best examples that I've shared with Christopher is the production of yam flakes here in Barbados many years ago, dehydrated yam flakes, which was a fantastic product which was exported all over the region and of course up into the UK, and was very successful. But for whatever reason, it did not have the sustainability that I think greater investment in it might have allowed. Now, that may have been for more than one reason. At that sort of time, those production capacities tended to be insular. In other words, we did not want other people to be producing those products. And so we prevented them from doing it rather than using the technique that I suggested earlier on of licensing the production to those people who could do it on a larger scale. And then, of course, you get your licensing revenue. I also wanted to say something quickly about the production linkages with Africa. I mean, I think one of the challenges we have had, as Christopher mentioned in his report and in his comments, is that our production systems and their export systems are based on commodity production, with some very narrow channels of export to the UK in particular. So sending products, goods from us to Africa largely still needs to go through shipping routes that go up to the UK, or these days go across to the States and then back across to Africa. There's no direct shipping route between the Caribbean and Africa. And that's a problem for goods, but it's not a problem for digital products. It's not a problem for weightless products, which can be sent by air. So the collaboration with LIAT and the African Air Services Company, I think, is going to provide an air link into Africa that could develop further and then become a way in which you can send products in. But those products have to overcome the cost of air transportation. So they have to be different products that people will be willing to pay higher prices for.
Thank you so much. So we are heading up to the half an hour mark. We're nearly finished. What I will do at this point is just give my panelists their final words. Your final thoughts on this, if you wish. I will start with Christopher first.
So yeah, and in speaking to Malcolm about the yeast flakes, I actually didn't, because I would have met him at the a day before, I think yesterday or the day before, and he would have highlighted some things that I couldn't even find in the literature. The yam flakes and the attempts in manufacturing and how we there's certain things that I found it, and I was kind of upset because I was like, well, I really missed this stuff. I've been trying to search it up too. But no, he really did provide a lot of insights and a lot of areas where I could improve on, and even Barry talks about taking the next step and making this a PhD paper. So thank you for all of your feedback and opening me up to a bigger picture.
Thank you so much, Christopher, as well, for being willing to be in the hot seat, so to speak. Not the hot seat. This is supposed to be a facilitative environment, but thank you as well. Malcolm, your final comments?
Yes. I see Adrian Curtin in the webinar chat has mentioned about the disease. And I think part of the answer to that, he's quite right. It wasn't followed up, and it wasn't, and the carrying the product further. So two things could have happened. We could have done the plant breeding research, which we had the capacity to do, to try and overcome that problem. Because if our yam was suffering from that disease, then it meant that there was a disease of yams internationally. And if we found a new variety that could overcome that challenge, then that was a licensable product that we could have exported to all the big yam producing countries. But we could also have imported yams to be able to overcome that objection to the resource base that's necessary for the production of yam flakes. But I would go even further. What we then needed to do was to license that company, had to license that technology to other companies where they could exploit economies of scale. So you could have moved the technology from Barbados to one of the big African countries that would have been producing yams disease-free on a huge scale. And we would have got the licensing revenues coming back in to Barbados as export earnings. So I think the idea of these intellectual property assets being licensed to other people, allowing distribution through channels of trade that don't rely on physical movement of goods, but on the digital environment, then allows us the opportunity to look forward into new industrial policies that are suited to the new potential of things like the digital environment and e-commerce.
Thank you so much, Malcolm, and thank you as well. I know you're quite busy, so we're really appreciative, and I see that my director has turned on her video, so I'll go over to her shortly for her final comments. But just to say certainly that we're very appreciative of you taking time out of your busy schedule, not only to give feedback to Christopher, but also in terms of participating in this event. So, Jan, over to you.
Thank you, Alicia. And I don't have to have the final word, but I did want to interject. First of all, and thank our student, our ex-student, who's one of our alum now, Christopher, to agreeing to come back and give us the benefit of your research. And I hope if there are any current master students on the call that they will see that there is light after the tunnel, at the end of the tunnel, that your work does excite interest. And on that note, also to thank one of our regional experts in this field, with, of course, his tinge of intellectual property and innovation, never being too far off. But I think, Malcolm, you have always been one of the leaders in thinking about innovation policy. And I don't see, for small economies like ours, to be quite honest, where we lack in scale, we have to make up in innovation and in innovative thinking. I see that this is the right time for this kind of thinking. Having said that, there's also, Guyana and Belize and Jamaica that have the land mass that we may be able to piggyback on as we think about industrial policy, maybe more in the traditional sense. And let me just say again that the audience questions, insightful, but very much interested. We have all of the participants who start, even if we had a little bit of a late start, all of the participants have remained on the call, on the webinar, which is a great indication to us that, one, there is interest in having more research-oriented webinars like this. Two, that people are interested in topics like industrial policy and all of the discussion about the green and sustainable approach to thinking about trade policy and industrial policy is very much ripe. So I'm going to hand back over to Alicia, but I did want to say that we will do more of these. I think we currently do one every semester. And this is something we want to continue. We do want to build up the research of the region. This is an area that everyone says really needs to be developed. And I think starting with our MIT students as a base for that research discussion is really, really a great way. So let me thank Alicia for always leading us on these initiatives, and thank the panel, Christopher comes in, Richard and Malcolm, for joining us, and to the wonderful audience for your rich questions and for your support of the SRC. And I'm going to hand back over to Alicia to do the closing, but thanks to everyone.
Thank you so much, Jan. I mean, Jan's closing was quite comprehensive, but it's just up to me to say thank you, Christopher. Cohort 20, someone had asked which cohort you were, cohort 20. Mr. Spence, Malcolm, Jan, my director, who is always supportive of my crazy ideas, and to the SRC staff, thank you so much again for all of your support, our IT technician, and you, the audience, for your very incisive and probing questions and your very strong engagement. So thank you, everyone. I wish you a wonderful remainder of your evening.